IVM. Someone I know had a baby recently. I was thinking about it and I realized that she would be nearly my age, 26, in the year 2047. And it got me wondering, what kind of country are we imagining for ourselves in 2047, 100 years after independence? What route should our foreign policy take for India to take its rightful place as a world leader? What course corrections do we need so that Indians can fulfill their destiny? Welcome to States of Anarchy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan. Every week on the show, I talk about topics in global affairs and foreign policy, all in the hope of making a little more sense of the world around us. We're all having a hard year. The Indian economy is contracting. Our young people have fewer jobs, even though they're extremely qualified. Our women are dropping out of the workforce. Against this backdrop, a lot of people think that we don't need to be sending vaccines to our neighbors in South Asia. We need to be focusing on our own growth. To be honest, this is not a view that's held only during a pandemic year. When India gives money for a space program or to build hospitals in developing countries, Indians are quick to point out that this is money that could have been used to uplift the poorest districts in our own country, which don't have the most basic facilities. But foreign policy isn't such a zero-sum game. India is a big country full of contradictions. We have some of the poorest, most unequal villages in the world, as well as some of the most successful companies and people. Our foreign policy, therefore, finds itself hostage to this internal wrangling of how we see ourselves as a nation. So, how should India project itself as a global superpower? What should it do on the world stage to assume its rightful place? How can its foreign policy improve the lives of 1.2 billion people? These are questions that need big answers. And I'm going to use the help of my guest today for some insight. Mohammad Zishan is a foreign affairs columnist and author of Flying Blind, India's Quest for Global Leadership. He writes for The Diplomat on South Asian affairs and also authors a Sunday monthly column in the Deccan Herald. We're going to talk about the directions that Indian foreign policy needs to take, but after a short break to hear from IVM Podcasts.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and LinkedIn too, for that matter. And we've been putting up some content on LinkedIn, so do check that out. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Storytel and The Whole Truth Foods. Thank you for supporting us. So, great week on the network again this week. Definitely do check out the Pragati podcast. Pavan spoke to Chris Ashok. They discussed science, knowledge, and the wonder of Indian home cooking. Staying in the realm of food, on This Round Is On Me, we had A.D. Singh as a guest. Gauri and A.D. discussed the 10 years anniversary of The Table and the 20-year anniversary of Olive. So two of Bombay's biggest restaurateurs have a conversation about the restaurant business. All Things Policy celebrated 500 episodes on January 27th. Manoj talks to Aditya and Anirudh about the surprising origins of the podcast, its evolution over the last few years, and its exciting future. This episode also marks their video debut, so definitely do check that out on YouTube. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet talks to Ranjit Pratap Singh. Ranjit is the co-founder and CEO of Pratilipi. Pratilipi is a company that's recently acquired IVM, and Ranjit on this episode discusses his plans to build a homegrown media empire, his love for comics, and how India can have its own comic cinematic universe. And finally, Cyrus had an exciting week. We had some amazing guests this week. We had Vishal Gondal come and talk about Fauji. We had Atish Tathir talk about the various issues that he had been facing with his OCI card and other things like that. We had Adam Dow talk about things going on in the US and the evolution of what's happening there. We had Siddharth Kannan come and talk about his history with Cyrus and his new show. So definitely do come check that out as well. And with that, let me take you back to your show.
Welcome to States of Anarchy, Zishan. Thank you so much for joining me on today's podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Congratulations on your new book. I really enjoyed reading it. And I think if you're young and you're new to foreign policy, then it has a lot of very interesting arguments for everybody. And it makes me wonder, when it comes to foreign policy, India has sort of, a long, drawn-out history at international forums and in international affairs generally. So what do you think is wrong with how we've been doing foreign policy so far?
I mean, look, it's tough to do a proper analysis of India's foreign policy history and evaluate it properly because, India is one of those countries that has changed very quickly and dramatically over the last especially few decades. And I think the way that foreign policy works in India is that it's very dependent on who is in power in terms of, the personality in power. So there's a lot of personality diplomacy that takes place. So, for instance, in my book, I talk about Jawaharlal Nehru's activist foreign policy, being very globalist and internationalistic in his approach, taking an interest in conflicts very far away in Korea and Cambodia and the Congo and so on. I talk about how this was a very curious and strange thing to happen because Indian strategic thinking in some sense has never spread itself out that far over the centuries. And so I say that it was more Nehru's foreign policy than India's foreign policy, Nehru also being the foreign minister of India in his government for a long time. And over the years, I think that what happened, of course, is that after the war with China in 1962, India realized that it had far overshot its material limitations and capabilities. And we were dependent on food aid from other countries. We were still suffering from droughts and famines at home. Many of our people were, of course, obviously very poor and illiterate as well. And so there was quite rightly questions being asked, I think, when Indira Gandhi became the prime minister, about whether India should still have a focus that was so internationalistic and activist in approach around the world, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and elsewhere. And I think in some sense, Indira Gandhi decided to bring back India's foreign policy to the neighborhood where Indian strategic thinking has traditionally always been comfortable. And so she fought the war, of course, with Pakistan for the liberation of Bangladesh. Rajiv Gandhi as prime minister, the highlight of his tenure in office was the peacekeeping mission in Sri Lanka. And so India then became a sort of a more regional power, or a power that was more obsessed and occupied and preoccupied in many ways with the neighborhood. And obviously, the arresting conflict and hostilities with Pakistan have kept India there forever. But I think what's happened is that since the liberalization of the Indian economy in the 1990s, and then, the economic boom period that followed thereafter, I think India's capabilities have obviously grown a lot. And also the world around us has changed. We are no longer in a unipolar setup. It's a more multipolar setup. America, has been withdrawing and retreating from its unipolar leadership role on the world stage for a while now across administrations, including, I would say, Barack Obama himself. And I think that's going to continue even into Joe Biden, even if he does rejoin the WHO and try to undo some of the very radical things that Donald Trump did. So it's opened up a lot of space for many of the other emerging powers coming up on the world stage, India, China, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, and others like ourselves, to have a more proactive role in setting the global agenda, setting up the norms of global governance and how the world should work. And I think that India should certainly see itself as one of the countries in the decades to come as a country that should take up a leadership role. In my book, I talk about how India is in many ways a very natural power on the world stage today. Unlike in the 50s and 60s when, we still were dependent on food aid. Of course, we still have developmental challenges at home, but I wouldn't say that they are as existential as they were in the 50s and 60s. And certainly our economy is now a lot more globalized, so we rely a lot more on external affairs and external relations. We rely on other countries for how we do trade with them. We rely on them for bargaining chips in negotiations in various forums. We obviously rely on them for support against threats to our national security and other things. And we have a more globalized diaspora now with at least one person of Indian origin or an Indian citizen in every country in the world, barring three that I mention in my book. I leave it to the listeners to figure out which those three countries are. One of them is fairly obvious. So I think in that sense now India is much more dependent on the rest of the world. And so our approach and attitude also has to change. We cannot still reside, our strategic thinking cannot still reside in the immediate neighborhood. I think we need to start thinking of ways to convert the neighborhood from being a liability to an asset, the way that Germany has managed to do with the EU. and the Southeast Asian countries have managed to do by sticking up for each other. So I think India needs to start thinking about how these things can happen so that we can start thinking about expanding our influence beyond the shores of our neighborhood, and also certainly our strategic thinking capacity beyond the concerns of the neighborhood itself, thinking about global governance a lot more, thinking more about what India should stand for at the UN, what kind of values and principles we should stand for, speaking up on important politically sensitive topics that are important to other countries, like the conflict in Syria or, nuclear proliferation in Iran, or the conflict, of course, in Korea, where we've historically had a role in the past, as I mentioned. So I think we need to start now expanding these horizons further, because India has grown, India's needs and interests have grown, and therefore India's foreign policy also must grow.
There's a lot to unpack in what you said. I think, for one, India's foreign policy has been largely personality driven, but I don't think that's a phenomenon that's limited to India alone, right? Like, leaders around the world want to sort of leave their mark on foreign policy for their countries. And so, whether it's Xi Jinping or Donald Trump, so you have leaders who want to make foreign policy their own domain. Maybe in India, it's more evident because our first prime minister was also in charge of external affairs. So that's one thing that I was thinking of. The second, what struck me about what you were saying is, whenever India wants to play a larger role in international relations, the fact that we still have some of the poorest areas in the world, some of the most unequal societies, and some extremely pressing social problems, people point out that, why do we need to send a mission to Mars when we can't take an auto from place A to place B? We don't have enough roads. We don't have drinking water. Why do we need to build hospitals in countries on the African continent when we don't have healthcare for our own citizens? So why do you think it matters that India plays a bigger role in foreign policy on the world stage? Why should it worry about the conflict in Syria, or why should it care about what role it shapes international organizations?
Those are both excellent questions and points. I'll address the first one because I think it's something that people do not think and talk about enough. That is, India's foreign policy being personality driven, or that other countries also have personality driven foreign policies. I think one of the distinguishing factors, I would say, in India's foreign policy is that a lot of the basic tenets of Indian foreign policy are not exactly clear. For instance, it's not clear. We talk quite often across administrations about India being a democratic power. But on the world stage, in the outside world, it's not clear what India means by saying that we are a democratic power. Does it mean that India is going to stand up for democratic principles around the world? We speak about it quite often, but then, we obviously take our share of U-turns. In Nepal, for instance, when the constitution drafting process was underway, initially we said that this is Nepal's internal matter. We're not going to talk about it. We are not going to do anything about it. There were obviously some interest groups within Nepal that wanted India's interference from an early stage itself, but India said no. And then once the constitution came out, obviously India was very explicit in its disappointment. And similarly, in the Maldives, for instance, when President Nasheed was deposed in a coup a few years ago, he actually had publicly asked for India's support and help as he was being dragged across the streets in Malé. And India obviously took its fair share of flack for sitting back and not doing anything. And then China swooped in thereafter and obviously gave its wholehearted political support to the new post-coup regime. And that made India seem even more as a lame duck regional power in South Asia. So I think that a lot of what's happening in India is that because a lot of the basic tenets of foreign policy have not been set in stone or decided upon in New Delhi, whenever the prime minister comes up and he looks at a crisis, he says, let me handle this my way. And then he leaves his personal stamp on that. And so it seems like India is not able to figure out what India as a nation would stand for. We're quite clear what Jawaharlal Nehru as prime minister stood for. We're quite clear what Indira Gandhi as prime minister stood for. But then thereafter, ever since, we're not quite clear about what India as a country, as an emerging power should stand for, what sort of values we should espouse, what sort of stances we should take on important conflicts that may be more important to other countries than ourselves. And so therefore, I think that, we see this personality-driven factor a lot stronger, in my view, in India. In the United States, for instance, obviously a lot more mature global superpower than ourselves. The Democrats and the Republicans obviously disagree with each other on most things and many things. And I'm going to leave Donald Trump out of this because he's an anomaly. And, whenever I talk to American foreign policy analysts and commentators, they said, Donald Trump, he's a minority government. Don't talk about him. He's going to leave office anytime soon. And so he did. But barring Donald Trump, I think that if you look at the Democrat and Republican parties and party leaders, they are, I think, by and large, quite certain and sure about what America stands for. They do talk about democracy quite often, and they also talk about, standing up for the self-determination rights of people in Palestine or Somaliland or wherever else. Of course, there is a certain amount of realpolitik that comes into play, propping up dictators, especially during the Cold War more than today. In my book, I actually address this point as well. Why America stands for an activist foreign policy, what kind of a role domestic political discourse has played in that, and also how, the Cold War calculations of communism being more important than democracy or self-determination had actually played a role, in my view, in America propping up, a lot of unsavory dictators around the world. And I also talk about a few examples like that of Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, who was propped up by America during the Cold War, but then when Ronald Reagan became the president, he actually backed a rebellion that overthrew Ferdinand Marcos. And at that point in time, if you read, media reports in the American news media, they talk about how Ronald Reagan had no choice but to do this because, there was no communist angle to that rebellion in the Philippines. So I think that the communist calculation was quite important there. But even so, even if you do take the Cold War, then I would say that the basic tenet of American foreign policy across administrations, during the Cold War was that America should fight and counterbalance against communism, at all costs quite often. In India, that basic tenet is not quite clear to me as yet. Your second question, which I think is extremely important, is why should India take an interest in these difficult conflicts so far away when we've got problems of our own? And the preface of my book actually is designed to address this very question. The very first line that I write in my book is that when I talk to Indian friends and I tell them about, India having to play a more proactive role in world affairs, they often stop me midway and they ask, why the hell should we do this? What's in it for us? We have so many problems at home and so on. But as I said earlier, I think that India and India's development now, as we quite rightly realize, cannot take place in a vacuum. We do live in a globalized world, whether we like it or not, whether we want to be self-reliant or not. That is the fact of the matter, and that's the fact of our growth story. India's growth story is very strongly linked to the kind of trade that we did and the sort of immigration opportunities our people received to go abroad and to study and live and work there and then send back billions of dollars in remittances. Kerala, for instance, is a shining example of that. A lot of the income that you find in many families in Kerala actually comes from abroad. And similarly, of course, Indians at home as well rely a lot on the bargaining chips that they receive in order to get their fair share of trade, as well as, sharing of resources with our neighbors. For instance, fishermen from Tamil Nadu and the water sharing issue that they have with Sri Lanka. Obviously, all of these issues, I think, for India to resolve and for India to have, a more positive outcome requires that Indian foreign policy and the Indian government has more influence on what happens abroad. And, I can go on. There are several examples, of course, as I said, that India's diaspora is spread across the world. And as a result, we always see that whenever there's a civil war in Libya or in Yemen, our Air Force and our Army has to conduct very painful exercises to evacuate several people who are stranded and caught in the crossfire. And oftentimes this happens when India does not even have, a voice at the table and is not even present in the decision-making and the negotiations that go on in these conflicts. And so I think in many ways, I think all of these things add up for me to say that if India wants to develop its economy, if India needs to, and I haven't even gotten to the very important indicator that I write in the preface of my book, which is the passport index, and the fact that India ranks very low there. And that obviously impacts the immigration opportunities and the business transaction opportunities that Indian people are able to achieve. So there is a litany of factors, a multitude of factors that I would say that for reasons why India should take more of a role and more of an interest in what goes on around the world.
Both of these are very interesting answers because they both sort of bring me to one point, which is the non-aligned movement. I think one reason that India hasn't acted, or it's flip-flopped, as you say in your book, is because the non-alignment movement was supposed to sort of carve out a niche where India and other countries who didn't want to be an active part of Cold War geopolitics would be able to trade and create like the best opportunities of development for themselves. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why people in India also see it in that way. On one hand, we want to be sort of a global superpower, but on the other hand, we essentially think of all of us as middle class, all of us as, developing countries. So we don't think of us as a voice that needs to be louder.
Yes, what's funny about that is that the non-alignment movement and the way that it was conceived by Prime Minister Nehru at the time was as a very activist movement. Non-alignment did not mean sitting on the fence. It meant that we will take positions different, or, it would not necessarily align with the positions of America or the Soviet Union. We would do what we believe is in the interest of the developing world and the post-colonial world. And that's why a lot of the post-colonial countries bought into that narrative. They said that here is a country that is championing our interests, independent of the two superpowers of the day. And as a result, you see, what Nehru did as part of the non-alignment movement was get involved very deeply and proactively in a number of conflicts around the world, as I said. But what's sad is that over a period of time, non-alignment has become, in some sense, a synonym for fence sitting in Indian foreign policy discourse. And so non-alignment means we will not be on this side of the fence or on that side of the fence. We'll just sit on the fence and watch what's happening on both sides. But this, again, I think is a result of India not being able to properly define what it should stand for. You can be non-aligned or you can be strategically autonomous and yet stand for things that are very important for the rest of the world. I'm not saying that India should parrot whatever America is saying, or that India should parrot whatever Russia or China is saying on every single issue. I'm saying that India should, start building a set of interests and norms that would capture what India is about, as well as what the rest of the developing world needs today. And so in my book, I talk about several of the very important things that developing countries around the world are talking about today. One of them being, the establishment of credible state institutions in developing countries that can deliver effective public services around the world. And so, the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN, for instance, is one such initiative. And that was actually not championed by the US or the UK. It actually came the impetus for it came in large part from countries like Mexico and Guatemala and other developing countries around the world. And so I think India should take up these sorts of causes that matter to the developmental needs of countries around the world, which are quite frankly very similar and common to the developmental interests that India itself has. In my book, I quote Mr. Ambassador Syed Akbaruddin, who I had the great privilege and honor of working with at the UN. And, he told me that, look, I think we should think about India as the world's largest development laboratory. So we try and experiment along with other countries what works, what kind of initiatives work at the grassroots level in developing our state institutions, in delivering public services, in taking care of the healthcare and education needs of our people. And a lot of these interests obviously are shared by countries like Kenya and Tanzania and Ethiopia and Mexico and Guatemala. And oftentimes, they would either share their lessons with us or we would share our lessons with them. Now, right now, this is happening in a very ad hoc manner. I'm saying that India should institutionalize this and build a set of norms, that would make sense for India as well as for other countries around the world, and then stand up for making these the norms of global governance at the UN and in other global decision-making bodies. So that's, I think, the way that I would approach. I don't know if I went off track from the question that you asked me.
No, not at all. I was just thinking about state institutions, right? And I think it's a very interesting point that you make there. India's ITech, for example, the Technical Exchange Cooperation Movement, has been extremely successful. But I think, as a devil's advocate, I would still be like, there are still so many problems with our own state institutions. They're paralyzed by bureaucracy and corruption and inefficiency. And so I'm not sure how many countries would want us to export these models there. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. But the way that I conceive this again is not that India is lecturing the rest of the world to do what India wants them to do. I think, in my view, it should be a bit more of a knowledge sharing network. Now, I think if you talk to people in Nigeria or other places around the world like that, where it's not very common to see democratic transfer of power from one democratic government to the next, they often do look in envy at how India manages to do this. How are you also quite, poor and many of your people are not as educated as the West, and yet you manage to build a democratic country that is in many ways institutionally as mature as many parts of the West, has a functional constitution that until quite recently most people did not really think much about or debate about. And so I think that a lot of those things, I think on many of those parameters, India is still quite far ahead. But at the same time, as you said, I think there are things that we can also learn from other countries. There are initiatives and developmental programs in countries like Indonesia and Ethiopia and so on that have worked very well in increasing transparency of state institutions, cutting down on corruption. We should learn from them as well, just as much as we give them. But I'm saying that we do this through the ITech in a very ad hoc bilateral manner. So it's always India sitting with Egypt and talking about this, or India sitting with Kenya and talking about this. I'm saying bring everybody together like Nehru did with the NAM and, build more cohesive knowledge sharing network, so to speak. The G20 does this, the WEF does this, but they are all very small in scale, and honestly speaking, most developing countries are not part of those efforts. So that's where I think India has an opportunity to play a very important role. And obviously go from being bilateral to becoming more multilateral so that countries say, oh, this is not just, obviously India is leading and organizing the effort, just as we did with the NAM in the early days at any rate. But at the same time, this is not just India looking down, through its, under its nose and telling other countries do this and do that because, look, we are the superpower and, it worked for us. You guys are poor and underdeveloped. It would be sort of more from their perspective, an opportunity to be part of a developmental journey with India and other developing countries around the world. India does this, as I said, in a very ad hoc manner. But if we institutionalize this, the foreign policy influence impact of it would be obviously a lot higher.
That's a very innovative idea, because whenever I think about how India does cooperation, in a sense, with other countries, it has a disdain for multilateralism, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we like the idea of being part of big organizations, but, whether it's the recent Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that we backed out of, or, of course, in our own neighborhood, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SAARC, it has been quite isolated, or it prefers to deal on bilateral fronts rather than on multilateral fronts. And I remember that in your book, you'd written a little bit about it with respect to the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And you'd particularly spoken about India sort of flip-flopping from side to side. And I'm going to quote from your book for a second. You say, quote, "India is now too large and too powerful to step in the middle of a geopolitical seesaw without making either side wary of its presence. As one senior diplomat put it to me at the United Nations, India is no Norway. If India were to mediate in a dispute, it would invariably hold more sway than a smaller country. And if it mediated without a clear policy stance on the conflict beforehand, both warring parties would doubt its intentions and its credibilities. And I thought this was very prescient in the sense of particularly what's happening today. India had a chance to mediate with Myanmar and Bangladesh in the Rohingya issue, for example, and we didn't do that, and China did, which spoke a lot too about China's mediation powers and less of ours. So do you think this flip-flopping reflects both in sort of the way India does bilateral, multilateral policies as well as how it deals with countries on a whole?
No, absolutely. And, that Myanmar and Bangladesh example, pretty much makes my point for me because, think about it think of international politics as a big playground with a bunch of people. Some of them are bullies, some of them are, not bullies. And, if you've got, two children on the playground fighting with each other, obviously if you are one of them, whom would you pick as a mediator? Would you pick somebody who is sneaky, whom you don't know much about, who sometimes picks you and sometimes picks the other person, or sometimes says one thing and then says something else behind your back? Obviously you wouldn't pick that kind of a person to be the mediator in a conflict between you and the other person. You want to pick somebody who you are quite clear and confident about in terms of what they stand for and what, they believe in. And so there's a certain predictability that needs to be a quality of a powerful country as a mediator. If you're picking a small guy on the playground who's not really going to make much of a difference, then obviously if you don't like what he's saying, you can bully him and shoo him away. But if a large power comes in between and then tries to mediate, you obviously want them to mediate only if you're quite clear and confident about, whether they are going to stand for common interests between you and the other person. And so as a result, if they will be able to resolve that conflict, bring some kind of a compromise between you that you can actually have trust and confidence in. So I think Chinese soft power is obviously not very high. China knows this. Everybody knows this. Chinese people know it, even if they don't talk about it very much if you meet them abroad. But what's quite clear about China is what they stand for. China has never spoken up for democratic rights anywhere in the world unless, in some sneaky way it actually meets their narrow interests. And very rarely has that ever happened. I honestly can't think of a single instance where China came up and said that this minority being harassed by this autocratic government should be given their own rights of self-determination. That's never really happened. They might make the odd throwaway statement on Palestine or something like that, but that's not because they are committed to a policy of self-determination. What China is quite clear about, as I mentioned in my book, is that they want to export their sort of one-party bureaucratic state model to the rest of the world. And you see this quite clearly in, albeit low-profile, political training programs that are taking place in Africa as we speak today. And they've been happening for the last several years, and nobody's really talked about it quite as much around the world. And they are essentially bringing in, officials from de facto one-party states like Ethiopia, for instance, where, the same party has been in power for several years now. And they are giving them, training on various policy-making and even propaganda techniques in the Central Party School in Beijing. And then they are sending them back and, obviously conducting these sorts of exchange programs. And they have always been quite clear about their dedication to sovereignty, even if, and especially if I would say, it comes at the cost of democratic processes in that country. And if somebody in that country is saying that, hey, let's turn our country from an autocracy to a democracy, and the autocrat is busy killing these people on the streets and, trying to quash the rebellion, China never ever comes up and says, let's speak up for the rebels. It always says state sovereignty, the world should keep out of that. So China is quite clear about this, and people can trust them when they say this because that's the way China works on the inside. And so it's quite, in my view, consistent with Chinese domestic political interests as well and what the Communist Party of China wants for itself. Whereas when India comes into a conflict and, tries to say things that it's not consistent about, obviously both sides in the conflict are wary of whether India is going to change its position down the line. What's going to happen? India is only going to get more powerful in the years ahead. So can we trust India to do what they're saying? Or is a new government going to come to power in New Delhi? And then, as I said, personality-driven foreign policy. Will a new prime minister say that, my predecessors spoke utter rubbish, this is now new India, Naya Bharat, and so we are going to do this instead. So it's not just in domestic policy, these things can happen in international politics as well. And other countries, quite frankly speaking, are thinking about this a lot more than India is at the moment, because they look at India's demographic projections. They know India is a very large country, and they know that India is also an ambitious country. I call my book a book on India's quest for global leadership, because India has a quest for global leadership. And so they look at all of these things and say, 10 years down the line, 15, 20 years down the line, India is going to be a more powerful stakeholder on the world stage. So if they are saying something today, are they going to change their track tomorrow? Are they going to be consistent in what they're saying? Is it more importantly consistent with domestic discourse in India and consistent with India's domestic political and economic interests? And if it is not, then obviously it is not trustworthy at all. And, then it doesn't matter whether we use airy, fairy, flowery language to express ourselves or, if we just put it in front of them quite bluntly.
I agree with you. I think I wouldn't call it sort of like a strategic incoherence, but I will definitely say that from an other country's perspective, I could see why it would be difficult to deal with India, considering how many times they would have to do the same negotiations over and over again. And I guess that's reflective of our internal bureaucracy at the end of the day, right? Like what we're projecting on the foreign affairs side is what's happening within the country. As you and as many other people have pointed out before, that India's foreign service is extremely small. We barely have the same number of diplomats as Singapore. And so it's a large task for a small group of people to handle entire global relations. And often that is the case where you're in charge of whole regions, several countries, several different areas. So I can understand that sort of strategic lacunae, because you don't have time to think about long-term plans, right?
There's another thing that actually happens which people probably don't realize. And that is, if you have a small foreign service personnel posted to an embassy abroad, one thing is that they don't obviously get space to think strategically, but the other thing is that they are, in some sense, completely occupied with very minimalistic responsibilities. Trying to issue visas, trying to do that bureaucratic work for citizens there as well, citizens who are trying to come to India, etc. And they're thinking very bilaterally as well as a result. If you are an Indian diplomat posted to Sweden, you are completely consumed. Your entire work time goes just thinking about bureaucratic work that concerns the Swedish people and Indians in Sweden and Swedish people in India and so on. You're not, first of all, thinking about what's really Sweden's political and economic interests, but more importantly, you're also not thinking about the region as a whole. You're not able to think as much about Scandinavian politics or the EU's politics. And then you're not also able to coordinate your policies with other Indian missions that are posted in Brussels or London. It obviously happens. I'm not saying that it does not happen at all. But I'm saying that as a result of the fact that India has, a limited personnel deployed abroad, they are constrained to prioritize certain tasks above other tasks. And so as a result, they're always being reactive. Mm-hmm. And reactive obviously means ad hoc, because something develops and then you obviously have to react to that. And then by the time you're, back, something else develops and then you're reacting to that. There's nobody actually seeing your back or, trying to have your back and then saying that, okay, you take care of the ad hoc tasks and I will look at all the other stuff. India has one officer at the UN, for instance. When I was there, I saw one officer who dealt with trade issues as well as UN General Assembly elections, as well as security issues. All of these things came under one single officer's desk. And I worked with this person and he was obviously quite overwhelmed every single day, looking at all the files that came in. And if you walk into the U.S. mission, where I had a few of my friends, American friends working, they had multiple officers doing all of those singular tasks. So that, I think, is a thing that we do not, as strategic thinkers and analysts in India, we do not really realize and think about as much as we should.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you and I might no longer join the foreign service, but perhaps expanding that would definitely provide a good leeway. I know that there are a lot of considerations and a lot of sort of bureaucratic politics that's involved in that, but that would definitely be something that I think would be necessary for India. And it makes me, all of this also brings me to sort of specific areas. With America, for example, you argue that the partnership between India and America is only set to grow. And I thought that was very interesting because most people don't assume that India and America have ever had bad relations because they don't think of a they can't envision a pre-Cold War,
Pre-91.
Pre-91, my bad, yeah. Like a pre-91 sort of relations where India and America weren't on the same foot always. So how do you see this relationship as growing?
Look, I mean, I think that insofar as basic fundamental national interests grow, that is the way that domestic politics takes place or the way that the economy grows, I think insofar as these basic factors and characteristics are concerned, India and the United States have a lot more common ground than any other emerging powers, and any other emerging power and a global superpower like the U.S. I would say that because of the fact that India is a very large country and India is a developing country and India comes from Asia or the Oriental East, the partnership with India in many ways is more central to, and the fact that India is a growing economy and an emerging power that's only on the upslope. I think all of these factors make India more important to the United States than any other U.S. ally, including post-Brexit UK that has shot itself in the foot, or the EU that is trying to figure out if it should start dealing with China a lot more closely, or Australia or other countries that have traditionally been in the American camp. I think that India's fundamental interest, the fact that we are a service sector driven economy, the fact that we have very, very strong incentives to promote democracy around the world. Nobody would say this, but I would say that India should promote democracy. Democracy promotion is in many ways a core incentive or interest area for Indian foreign policy in the years to come. And I've got two entire subsections in the book that people should read with interest to find out why I'm saying this. And in many ways, an even stronger interest than I would say the United States has to promote democracy and democratic ideals and principles around the world. So I think all of these factors put together make India a very natural ally for the U.S. And that's why you see that if you talk to people in Washington, they would often express frustration with India for the fact that India wants to play both sides, the fact that India wants to import weapons from Russia or sit in the RIC summit, that is Russia, India, and China, and the fact that India until recently had cold feet with the Quad alliance with America, Australia, and Japan until recently. All of these things frustrated Washington quite a lot, as I found out when I was in the U.S. And that frustration has been building for a number of years, but at the same time, America's foreign policy establishment is very patient with India because they recognize, I think, in many ways that these basic interests are common. And so at some point in time, India is going to come around. At some point in time, finally India is going to say, and that's already happening because China is starting to attack us. At some point in time, India is going to say, all right, let's take the Quad out. Let's start the car and, build something out of this. And they are just patiently waiting for that moment to come. And so in many ways, I think the ball is in India's court to build this partnership into something higher. Very rarely does America come up and say that, this is not something that we are not willing to do with India or that an Indian proposal is shot down. It's always the other way around. America, even for Israel, America did not legitimize a nuclear program the way that it legitimized India's nuclear program. And it has been consistently in favor of India's Security Council permanent seat bid across administrations. That's the one thing that Donald Trump and Barack Obama agreed on, ladies and gentlemen. So, that I think is the amount of bipartisan support that in many ways exists in America towards India. So the ball is in India's court. And what I think I would like to see India do is make America a partner in India's own capacity building and development. So in my book, I have an entire section about how this can be done across higher education, defense technology, and so on. There are, of course, a number of initiatives that have just started up. It's sputtering, the engine is cold, and, the choke is on, and so it's just getting started. But I think that India needs to get rid of its cold feet, be quite clear about what it really wants on the world stage, and decide whether Russia is going to be the partner that stands by India for that, or whether America is going to be the partner that stands by for that. I'm very skeptical about importing defense technology from both Russia and America, and I've written about this in The Diplomat and other publications that I write for as well. Because, if you are importing weapons, again, just as I talked about mediating in a conflict between sworn enemies, if you're importing weapons from two sworn enemies, can you really count on either of them to give you their very best technology? Because they don't know if you're going to be fighting on the enemy side somewhere down the line. So what is the incentive for Russia to be shipping off its very best equipment and weaponry to India, while the Indian foreign minister is, throwing jabs at the Russians for criticizing the Quad, or for the Russians taking a soft stand on China and so on? This has happened already in recent months. The Indian foreign minister has not named Russia, but has contradicted Russia's statements very pointedly on issues like the Quad. So when that is happening, how much can you really count on Russia to give their best weaponry? And really, we need to ask ourselves if America cannot be substituted for whatever weaponry we're getting from Russia. Or are we trying to use Russia in some sense as a bargaining chip to get better technology from America, which I think is probably one of the calculations that's happening. I think that we do not need to do that if we act on the common interests that already exist between India and the United States, many of which, in my view, are not yet explored in Africa and Latin America, at the UN, and so on. And so down the line, I think 2 or 3 decades down the line, I would like to see India being able to, import the very best defense technology from America, develop America's very best technology in defense jointly, not have terms and conditions attached to this, because common interests would be served by India being developed to that level of military strength, particularly because of geographical factors, if nothing else, the fact that India is in the east and America is in the west and China is in the east, and having a militarily strong and powerful India to fight against China in its neighborhood is actually in America's very best interest, and America knows this. So I would like to see all of these things happen. I would like to see much deeper intelligence sharing, as I write in my book again, between Indian and American missions around the world, particularly in problem areas of the world where, a crisis needs to be sensed before it starts. I cite, for instance, in my book, the examples of Syria and Iraq and Libya as well, and talk about how if there was, stronger intelligence sharing and partnership between Indian and American missions in problematic parts of the world, India can actually become a much more proactive partner, diplomatic partner to America in, pursuing these common interests for political stability and democratic rights and norms and principles in problem areas of the world as well.
I'm glad that you came to sort of the next point that I was going to bring up, which is China. I found some of your opinions very interesting because China is sort of my area of expertise. How do you think India should deal with China, considering China's rise?
Yeah, I wrote a very blatant and pointed chapter on China, and one of my friends, when she reviewed the manuscript, she said, wow, it's like a tight slap in the face when I'm reading this, because especially since it comes just before the US chapter, which is, in her view, of a very different tone and tenor. But, I started working on that China chapter before these recent tensions, came up. I think when I was writing the chapter on China, I felt like I was being a bit more revolutionary or rebellious. But now I think India's domestic discourse is starting to move in that direction. India's strategic thinking is also starting to move in that direction, in seeing that there are very, very serious and fundamental conflicts and interests between India and China. the fact that our domestic politics is very different and works differently, the fact that the interests of India's democracy are very different, obviously, from the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. I always broke down quite diligently in my book the analysis of any of these partnerships and relationships to how those countries work on the inside, because I think that is how it determines how they interact and see the outside world. And so in China's case, in many ways, probably one of the more, in my view, obvious arguments that I make, but which might be provocative or even controversial, are that the Chinese Communist Party sees Indian democracy as a long-term existential threat. It does not even see American democracy as much as an existential threat as Indian democracy, simply because of the fact that India is, as I said, a power on the upslope, and India's influence is only going to expand in the decades ahead. India has a younger population than China, and more importantly, India is a developing country. So the success of American democracy, a lot of people in China who are democratic dissidents and activists try to get support from India. At one point a few years ago, I write my book, there was a group of Chinese democratic activists and dissidents that had organized a pro-democracy summit in India. And India issued visas and welcomed them, but then thereafter, for unknown reasons, had canceled those visas, and again, inconsistency and U-turns, right? So we, in some sense, shot ourselves in the foot, or ruined our own credibility in the eyes of what could have been a very important interest group within Chinese politics in the years ahead. So, in many ways, therefore, I think China does see, or the Chinese Communist Party, I should say, sees Indian democracy as a threat to its own model, in that if India can prove to Chinese aspirants for democracy that, look, you don't need to live in a country where freedoms are curtailed, you can still have growth even in a democracy, or that even a democratic developing country can become a powerful, influential state in world affairs, or that we can, as we are doing right now, develop and manufacture vaccines for the whole world. Any of these sorts of wins in Indian foreign policy that in some sense legitimize the Indian developing country democratic model is in many ways an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party. So therefore, China would obviously quite naturally try to, in my view, contain and constrain India's influence in the Security Council, or in nuclear suppliers group, or even in South Asia and in the Asia Pacific, and so on. And that's exactly what China is now doing, quite more obviously than they were previously.
I think I agree and disagree with you on certain points. I think on one hand, yes, China is cognizant of India's growing power, but I think they also sort of see it as a threat when it's in conjunction with the US. I think on the other hand, though, with China's views of Indian democracy, from my experiences talking to Chinese policymakers and Chinese people in general, I think the general view is that Indian democracy comes across as too chaotic, too messy. Yeah. I've had Chinese people come to me with very basic questions that I don't particularly think of, but they say, oh, why don't you want one language? It's great for development, right? And I think it's very easy for me to explain it to you, or maybe to explain to someone who has a background in pluralism. But I think when you have believed in your own growth story, and then you look over the fence, in a sense, and you see these people who are just as large as you, but have not been able to come out with the same way, right? I think this is also a problem within sort of like Indian strategic thinking, that we think so much about China day in and day out. But on the other hand, the Chinese don't think of Indians. Like, for them, this is something that I found interesting. If you look at GDP per capita, India would be closer to Nigeria, right? But we would never be considering ourselves with Nigeria. That's not who we're thinking of. We're thinking of China, right? Same way China is thinking of the US. Therefore, I'm not sure how much of a threat China sees us as. Do they want to make sure that the boundary question is resolved in their favor? Yes. Do they want to make sure that their interests are met in the South China Sea and possibly even the Indian Ocean, yes. But I think when it comes to your point on democracy, I'm not really sure that I agree.
Yeah. No, those are very good points, and I've actually written about this in my book as well, quoting Chinese media on Indian democracy and the fact that there is propaganda in the Chinese media over the years already about how Indian democracy is very chaotic. Exactly what you said, that it doesn't work, it's corrupt, and why don't you have one language? And Chinese democracy puts Western illusion in dust, and at the same time, India is very chaotic, and it just doesn't work, and so on. It cannot grow, etc. You're absolutely right. I think that at the moment, I would say that the Indian democratic model, in many ways, has not caught up to the amount of influence, or, as I write in my book, the wealth and power that the Chinese one-state model has built up. And yet, at the same time, in my view, I would say that although China and the Chinese government, or Chinese policymakers and the propaganda machinery would want to scoff at this and say that India is not working, blah blah blah, don't look at them, etc., and they also write about it publicly in the state media, I think that internally, or in terms of long-term strategic planning and thinking in Chinese foreign policy, I would be very surprised if China is not looking at what the world is going to look like 15, 20 years down the line and not see India somewhere in the orbit there and say that we need to get rid of this scenario or that scenario, and this is how we need to constrain India. Because make no mistake, China is trying to constrain Indian foreign policy power and influence on a daily basis. Otherwise, they would not be trying to build a highly unprofitable highway through Pakistan, or try to develop infrastructure in terrorist-infested areas of Central Asia, just in order to build a partnership with Pakistan and counterbalance India. They would not be speaking out against India's participation in the nuclear suppliers group. If China thinks that India is no threat, which is what India wants China to think, by the way, which is why I think India is trying to play both sides or sit on the fence, trying to say, China does not need to worry about us, or, that kind of stuff. It's not successful in my view, because China sees that there are fundamental interests common between India and the United States. So over a period of time, India is anyway going to align with the US on a number of issues, as we've already started doing. And at the same time, it's possible that, Indian democracy, if India becomes powerful, Indian democracy will become a threat 20, 30, 40 years down the line, particularly when the Han population in China ages and the Chinese workforce starts relying a lot more on the minorities who are quite younger in the renegade provinces around the Han heartland, which is obviously Xinjiang and Tibet and Taiwan and Hong Kong. So what China says publicly, or what Chinese academics and policymakers say, or even Chinese citizens say, does not, in my understanding, seem to align with what China is doing. If China does not consider India a threat, why should they be trying to contain and constrain Indian influence in the UN Security Council or in the NSG? What are they afraid of, right? Why do they keep trying to preempt the development of a Quad alliance? What are they afraid of? Because India has already said it's not an alliance, so why do they not believe India? And at the same time, if China is not thinking already about its demographic problems down the line, why are they suddenly taking such an interest in trying to re-educate, quote-unquote, the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang? Why are they trying to, control the way Buddhism works in Tibet? Why this new security law in Hong Kong and in Taiwan? All of these kinds of things, they are cropping up because China realizes that in the long-term future, it's going to have to, resolve a lot of these issues between the Han population in the mainland that is traditionally been quite loyal to the Communist Party, and the somewhat younger populations in the renegade minority provinces that have long wanted to detach themselves from Communist Party rule in China. So I would say that what China is doing more than what China is saying makes more sense to me, because their strategic interests are well aligned with what they are doing, with the Belt and Road Initiative, with putting down rebellions in Taiwan and Hong Kong, and trying to homogenize Xinjiang and Tibet and trying to constrain India's influence and growing heft, especially in South Asia, but also in the Asia Pacific, and then at the UN and other multilateral global decision-making bodies and so on. So I would say that this is where I was coming from, when I wrote that chapter. But, obviously, even my own experience speaking to Chinese people, as you mentioned, including my own friends at Columbia from China, was quite in line with what you were saying. They were somewhat more nationalistic and so on. I will say one thing about that language issue, though, because, even though it's a bit of a detour, I think that this sentiment is starting to take root among some Indians as well, particularly in the middle class, who are thinking like the Chinese propaganda machinery does, probably not the way Chinese strategic planners do, but the way that the propaganda machinery does, which is that one language, one nation is the way to go. For one, China is actually trying to rectify this already in that, they are taking to English language education a lot more passionately than the Indian government is taking. You would know a lot more about this than I do. And at the same time, I found it very interesting at Columbia and in the US, and even in the Middle East when I talked to and interacted and worked with Chinese expats. They were oftentimes quite envious of how easy Indians were with the English language. And the fact that the Indians were able to transact and speak to the Mexicans and the South Africans, and obviously the Americans and the British and even the Arabs and others, simply because Indians picked up the local language in that country much more easily, or because Indians obviously spoke English a lot more easily than the Chinese did. And this, for both these factors, I think India's multilingual setup and environment is very important. The fact that we are exposed to English in a larger scale than the Chinese, right from a very young age, means that when we migrate abroad or we transact business with people from other countries, we're able to speak English with them much more easily. And so therefore, we don't need to go to America and only socialize with Indian people. We can socialize and work with others as well, whereas the Chinese quite often feel constrained because, as they themselves put to me quite often, we have a language barrier. So can you, as a teaching assistant for economics, for instance, oftentimes I had Chinese students coming up to me and saying, we have a language barrier, we were not able to understand this concept. Can you give us one-on-one attention? And at the same time, also, even if Indians, migrate to non-English speaking countries like France or Germany or, other parts of the world, Indians actually pick up the local language a lot more easily than the Chinese do, because we are much more at ease in a multilingual environment. And so, my family, for instance, I was born in Jakarta. I picked up Bahasa Indonesia. My family, half of my family is Tamil, the other half is Malayali. So we speak both Tamil and Malayalam at home. And at the same time, I grew up in Bangalore, so I speak Kannada as well. And so that multilingual environment meant that when I went to the Middle East, I picked up Arabic a lot more easily. Even though I'm not fluent enough to do a podcast in Arabic, I can still understand some Arabic when, Arab clients speak to me. And I was able to pick it up much more easily and quickly than my Chinese co-workers, for instance, because they are brought up in a much more monolingual environment. So all of these things, I think, make for what we are seeing around the world as it stands today, very basic fundamental things that I think have not been analyzed enough in our discourse.
Yeah, I think, to add to your point about language, what's interesting is that China doesn't have one language, right? I mean, just because you call something a dialect doesn't mean there aren't a large number of people who are speaking it. So I think sort of the recognition that we give to each of our Indian languages here has not been there in China. But I still have a lot of friends who say, oh, I don't speak, standard Mandarin. I speak like Shanghai Hua, which is like, the Shanghai dialect or the Beijing dialect, or whichever region you're from generally has a dialect attached to it, right? And I think in some senses it makes sense, particularly if you're a South Indian. It's easy to move around other South Indian states because you can get most things, right? Even if you're not able to communicate in them. So I think in that sense, I really identified with sort of the dialects that they have. So I'm not sure it's sort of, like a monolingual country, but I do think that there is a huge demand for English and for other
that's right.
Chinese languages. On a lot of my WeChat groups, for example, and I think this is something the Chinese government has been cracking down on. You have 3-year-old kids who are doing online classes for one-on-one sessions with English teachers. And they say, oh, we want native English speakers. And they pay about 400 kwai or 4,000 rupees per hour for this kind of stuff. So the demand for English is something that's huge there. And, for me, I think it would be a pity if we want to replace that in India just out of a sense of misplaced pride in our nation. I think there are lots of ways we can be proud of our
what's interesting is that demand for English actually still exists with the less fortunate classes, because I've come across, rickshaw drivers and hairdressers and other people, gardeners and others like that, who pulled their children out of government schools at the primary level because they were not getting taught English properly. And, even though that education was free, they pulled them out of that and they saved up in order to send them to a private school, whichever they can afford, because as they put it, English is taught there and it's an English medium school and so on. So it's, I think it's, in my view, I would even say that it is elitist, this whole idea of saying that we should do away with English because of linguistic pride or whatever. I don't think poor people are thinking about pride and prejudice as much as the more privileged people are, because pride and prejudice, quite frankly, are products of privilege themselves. When you are thinking about where your next square meal is going to come from, or whether your children will be able to live a better life than you in a globalized world, they're not thinking in terms of pride and prejudice. They're thinking in very realistic terms of what's going on out there, where are the opportunities, what kind of education can give them opportunities, not whether I can feel good about my language, because I speak it anyway at home and, their children are brought up in that. I mean, I was never formally educated in Tamil, but I can read and write and speak Tamil. So, this, I think, is a very common thing with many Indians in the middle class and upper middle class children who went to fairly good schools and went to English medium schools. They are still multilingual. It's not that just because they went to an English school, they forgot their mother tongue or they don't talk Indian languages at home. So it's a very misplaced, I think, political sentiment in India.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. This is my last question for you, Zishan. What are books or resources that you would recommend to people who want to read more about Indian foreign policy?
That's a good question. To be honest, I'm a very slow, deliberative reader. So if I pick up a book, of course, there are books that I would sort of skim through as part of my research for whatever I'm writing, including writing this book. But, obviously the first book that you should read is Flying Blind. I forgot to say that, but it's pretty obvious, so I don't need to say it. But, other books that I think have influenced the way that I think are one very classical textbook on international relations, which is written by Hans Morgenthau, called Politics Among Nations. So it basically makes the case for, realism in foreign policy. And even though I talk a lot about ideals and principles and, norms and all of this soft, mushy stuff, I actually say them, and even in my book, I argue for them from a very realistic point of view. That is, to take into consideration Machiavellian perspectives on these things and how they would influence the way that other countries react and interact with us and the rest of the world. So that is, I think, one of the top books that I would say have influenced my understanding of international affairs. And that I think would be my number one or number two read after Flying Blind. The other books on India's foreign policy, particularly, obviously, there is no parallel to Shashi Tharoor's Pax Indica, and the depth and the breadth of that book is terrific. For especially the fact that he writes in the manner that he does. I think I read that in my college days, and I was not even studying international politics when I read it. I was in engineering college, and I was, able to still relate to it. So I think that's another great book on Indian foreign policy, which needs no introduction. A third book that I simply loved or rather, third and fourth books that I simply loved for the way that they explain the world that's actually unfolding before us, and even though they were written a long time back, seem quite prescient even today. One is Fareed Zakaria's Post-American World. Fareed is one of probably my most favorite writer on international affairs. I've tried to emulate his style a lot, even in my own writing. Post-American World by Fareed Zakaria, and the other book is Breakout Nations by Ruchir Sharma, which along with Ruchir Sharma's more recent book, which is The Rise and Fall of Nations, I think is very, very good and mandatory reading for people who are trying to understand international economics and how the economic interests of different countries have shaped up. Of course, he writes it more from a kind of an investment banker's perspective, because he is one, and the intended audience for that are investors and businessmen. But I think even for people who are trying to understand international affairs and economic issues in international affairs, those two books are very good books.
All right. Thank you so much, Zishan. Thank you for coming on this podcast and for talking with me.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure, and I absolutely enjoyed this.
Wonderful. That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. Thanks for sticking with us. I've attached Zishan's recommendations in the episode bio as usual, so do go check those out. If you have any comments or questions about global affairs or foreign policy, then you can send them across. Every fortnight, I answer listener questions about everything in international relations. Our email ID is ivmstatesofanarchy@gmail.com, or you can get in touch with us on Instagram @statesofanarchy or on Twitter @HamsniH. You can listen to States of Anarchy not only on the IVM Podcast app or website, but on iTunes, Ghana, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever you're using right now. We'll be back next week with some listener questions.
We live in an age of disruption, of immense change in every aspect of work, life, and business. But is the old way of doing things truly dead? And are we ever going to stop saying the new normal? Join me, Varun Dugirala, on Advertising is Dead every Tuesday as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, creators, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond to dig a little deeper into how we got here, what we're doing now, and where we're headed. You can catch all the episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcast from.
What are some of the radical changes that are now shaping our workspace? With physical distancing and heightened safety protocols being the norm, will technology finally make its large-scale entry to the workspace? Will design as we know it change for the long term? Is it possible for the Indian commercial real estate space to adopt a 360-degree approach to sustainability? Join our hosts at the Future of Space podcast by RMZ as we deliberate with industry leaders, analysts, and bright young minds on the way forward for the workspace given the new COVID normal. Tune in to the IVM Podcasts app or wherever you stream your favorite podcasts